Hi, it's nice to see you here today, Jökull. And this is Doug Hansen. He's going to be our technical advisor, but he's the Icelandic Roots treasurer and finance guy and in charge of all the places. And so he also does all our technology for the webinars and through the Icelandic National League at the United States. And he is the vice president there. So he wears a lot of hats, and we're really happy to have him here. And then I'm pleased to have Jökull Gíslason, and he is going to be doing our webinar today about World War II in Iceland, a blessed war. And so interesting, I was able to preview the slides and can't wait for this webinar. Jökull is an author and a detective and a former police officer.
No, correct. I am a detective.
Yeah, and a detective. He's a detective now, but a former police officer.
We're still police officers.
Oh, you're still a police. Okay, you're still a police officer. Yeah, great. And a longtime history enthusiast. He's taught courses with the department at the University of Iceland and the Re-Education Department since 2013. And he is really interested in World War II. And also, which my son thought was kind of cool, is he is an avid war gamer and designed several campaigns for that. And then he also started teaching in 2017 and wrote his first book in Icelandic, which I'll let him pronounce because I didn't practice saying it, about the Eastern Front and in World War II, and how this was the Red Army, and she spent her final years in Braveholt, which is near Reykjavik. So he can talk to you more about that. And then he wrote that second book, Iceland in World War II, The Blessed War. And now he's writing a third book in Icelandic. So we got to make sure that they get translated into English for everyone here in North America that's interested in this topic. And so the Iceland in World War II, it talks about how it affected the nation, and the first printing sold out, and this summer was a second edition. And one really cool thing, 32 years ago, he was an exchange student in Saskatchewan. And if you are an IR member and you want to jot his number down to see how you're related to him, it is, of course, starts with the letter I, and then 368586. And the person who's our team leader in charge of all the media in the database, Russ, he's your third cousin. Did you know that?
Cousin isn't far removed.
Yeah, pretty cool. Yes. All right, so we'll just get on with it today and let you start your PowerPoint presentation. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Good to see you. So I have a slideshow, and the slideshow is built up in such a way that I introduce myself on the second slide. So I think we'll just start from there, and at the end of it, we'll have a short time to discuss what's going, like if there are any questions about the book or about the topic. And if this goes well, we might do this again sometime in the future and take some other parts of the same topic. So here we are. And off we go. So, as Suna has already said and kindly introduced me, I wrote 2 books so far, and this was my second book. And it came to me that we didn't really have a proper book about Iceland's role in World War II in another language than Icelandic. We have a number of books in Icelandic, and we have a number of historians that have really dwelt into the subject. But what I wanted to do was to have a simple book that just gave you the overview of what's happening, sort of gave you the woods in general, and then a few highlights. And when I was preparing for this course, I decided to stick to the topic was why in Iceland we would call it a blessed war, because that's not really the experience for most of the other countries participating in the war, that it was a blessed war. But it had a huge effect on Iceland, both economical and culturally. So you could say that before the war, we were actually a poor nation within Europe, and we didn't have very close cultural ties with anyone outside Denmark. But that had changed a little bit in the 20th century. But the huge leap was this particular war and how it affected us. And she already gave you my, what do you call it, ancestor number? Anyway, the number that you could look up. But in any case, I left my full name there and my birth date if you want to try to see how we are connected. And if you have any particular questions you want to aim at me, I'll leave you with my email. And as you can see, my full name is Jökull Gíslason. And being that Gíslason, and I'm still Icelandic, Gísli Már Gíslason is my father, and his father was Gísli Kristjánsson. So when I was born, even though my first name is Gísli, I always was called by my second name. And a short side story of that, I have 3 daughters. And once I was traveling with 2 of them, and I stopped at passport control in England. And the person there, the passport controller, really wanted to know how I was connected with these 2 girls. And I told him I was their father. And then he said, aha, you don't share the same surname. I said, no, these are my daughters. And we use patronyms. So they are, I'm Jökull, these are my daughters, and they are both Jökullsdóttir. And then he looked at my passport, and my first name is Gísli, and he just looked at me with a blank face and said, how does this work? And I had to go off and explain that. But that all went well. So a little bit about myself. Yes, here you can see a few pictures of me through my life. The one in the top left corner is from Saskatchewan. I lived on a farm just outside Bigger, and I lived with a family that was half their ancestry was from Ukraine, and the other half was from England. However, while I stayed there, I got in contact with a number of people who had, well, second generation or even first generation Icelanders that were living in that area, and up to Gimli. So as for the book itself, wargaming has been a hobby of mine for a long time. And when Clint Eastwood shot his movie Flags of Our Fathers, I even got to play a soldier there for part of the takes. And that's a picture of me from that film. I have a very varied background and in a way privileged. For a time was working for the Red Cross in Africa, in a country called the Gambia. There you can see a picture of myself proclaiming my privilege. It's a thing, I'm sure it's everywhere in the world, sort of shaming privilege. I just think it's awesome. I'm aware of it, but I like my life. And there at the bottom, you can see me with my daughters and my wife. So that's a bit about me. The second slide is a little bit about how I sort of came into writing books. So wargaming was my first passion, and wargaming, some people might frown a bit upon it, but gaming done well and educationally is quite a good school, because if I quote Confucius, it would be that I hear and forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So wargaming does give you quite a strong, solid base when it comes to Second World War, if you're gaming it. And since I already then started teaching at the University of Iceland, I had some relations with the Russian embassy here, who knew that I had done lectures on the Eastern Front. And I was invited to take part in their celebrations on Victory Day. For them, it's the 9th of May. For us, it's the 8th of May, having to do with the actual time zones when Germany surrendered. So one year I offered to put up a table for them in their embassy, like where they had their party or their gathering. And I set up a scene from the Eastern Front. And I've done that every year since then, actually. But this particular year, it was a scene from 1944, campaign called Operation Bagration. And while I was there, we noticed this old woman who was in the room. She had medals on her chest. Like she was old. She was almost 90 years old. But during the reception, a woman about my mother's age comes up to me and asks me what place this is, because if you can look at the picture, you see there's a small town there. And I had to confess to her that these are just models which I painted and assembled. So they're done after pictures from this time, but it wasn't a specific location. However, I could tell it was 1944. And by my reasoning, it will most likely be somewhere then around Belarus, where most of the fighting took place. She walked away and came back a short while later and told me, my mother says you're wrong, because the old woman there on the picture is Maria Mitrofanova, and she was a soldier in the Red Army. and she took part in Bagration. And my mistake was the Belarus. She said that this town would have, with these shanty houses, would have always have been on the Russian side, because Belarus had much nicer houses and would probably have been near Smolensk. And from there, I actually got to know this woman, and I found it fascinating. First of all, I put up that table for that reception, and we're talking about a woman who had actually been fighting in that same area. She didn't want to give me any interviews to begin with, because she felt that she had not been the hero, which is not uncommon for someone at that time, her age. And she had been a radio operator. But eventually, we did manage to get a few interviews with her, and ended up being 8, and her daughter was always present. And she was telling most of her stories for the first time. Now, ideally, you do not interview someone when they're already 90-year-old. But in her case, she was telling us these stories for the first time. And to make it into a book, I sort of added to it the whole story of the Eastern Front in broad strokes. And then at the end of each chapter, Maria tells us about her life. I did find a publisher for this book. That was not easy. Many showed interest, but found it too hard to publish. And she soon told you that she had a hard time pronouncing the title. There's actually a little joke in there. You see, if you're publishing a book, your title should be preferably short and gripping. And this is not a short and gripping title at all. It's Föderlandsstríðið mikla or Maria Mitrofanova. But my publisher thought that this was the exact right title. And it basically means the Great Patriotic War and Maria Mitrofanova. And this Great Patriotic War is actually what the Russians call World War II. And that was her war. But then her life events turned in such a way that she spent her last years in Iceland and lived in Breiðholt, which is just a suburb of Reykjavik. So I find it, well, this is just something that happens in this century, that we are mixing populations between countries much faster than ever before. So back to the book. As Sin already said, it's the second edition. You can find a page on Facebook called Iceland in World War II. And generally speaking, it should be mostly stories about Iceland in relations with World War II. But I've been running this site for now 3 years almost. So there's also tidbits about World War II history in general. Might be some tidbits about Icelandic history that go further back or closer in time. And occasionally something that's like a travel article. So it's basically just a page for interest of many things, but it's fairly active and already has about 2,500 followers. So it's a fine page. And below there, you can see a picture of a ship. That ship was Icelandic for 4 years. It was called the Arctic. They never changed the name. It was bought as the Arctic. And that is the subject of my next book. And this particular picture is taken on the day that, not the day, it's taken out a few days after the British occupation of Iceland. So you see there's still some British soldiers arriving at the harbor, and the ship is there in the background, and we're very lucky that we have such a great picture of this ship. So off to the Blessed War. When I said that Iceland was poor before World War II, it was like really poor. It was probably on par with countries in Europe like Albania. We had been a rural community of farmers. We had very little industry of our own. Fishing had only been growing for a few decades, which was sort of missed out on all the centuries before. And you might know some of the things that are there on the picture. The statue there is close to the old graveyard in Reykjavik, and it's called Outlaws. And it's by, well, he probably is the greatest sculptor in Icelandic history. Einar Sigurjónsson made this statue in 1901. And there's quite a story behind it, because these people are outlaws. They are really poor, so they've probably stolen sheep, and that could be punishable by death. And they have been sort of outlawed from their community. And the man is carrying his dead wife on his back, and he's trying to bring her during night into the graveyard so he can place her in the graveyard, because she would not be buried in a graveyard if the authorities would find her. And he's carrying his children. And our turfed houses, many of which are still preserved. When around the year 1900, about 70% of the Icelandic population was still living in these kind of houses. and many of them could not really be called houses. They were more like shanties or huts. And I want to point out this book there. It's called Fátækt Fólk, which just translates simply into poor people. And it's written by Tryggvi Emilsson, born in 1902. And I don't think you can really add much to this book. He's telling about his life and his family, and all of the people in his family, like his father, his mother, his grandparents, none of them had enough money to own their own farm. So they were all laborers, and they were like really, really poor. And like in his lifetime, he lived to 1993. The quality of living for these people changed drastically. In fact, I almost would like to say that I doubt at any point in history you will see a bigger change from where they came from and where they ended. To the side of that, we have an interesting coin, because many of the merchants who were operating in Iceland, you had to sell them what you produced, and they would often give you coins that were only usable in their particular stores. So they would sell things very expensively, but they would buy everything cheaply, and people just didn't get real money, so they couldn't go anywhere else. They would just have to buy from this particular merchant. And at the top corner picture there, on the top right corner, my wife's grandfather, a few years back, we were having a party for him. He was then 80 years old, and he was talking about what he had eaten as a child. He was born in the Westman Islands, and no one was particularly rich in the Westman Islands when he was young. He was born 1922, and he said that his father, at the end of every summer, he would buy an old horse and slaughter it and put it into a barrel with salt. And then he said, I haven't had good horse meat for many, many years. And we who were present realized that that probably had to do with the fact that we are eating much better meats and much better food. So old horses which have been salted aren't really the greatest food anymore. And then he said, I have not had bræðingur either for almost as long as I can remember. And he said that in his childhood, that this was one of his favorites. And I asked him, what was that? And this is actually horse fat, which is boiled in a pot. And then you add cod liver oil or any kind of lýsi to it. And depending on how much horse fat you really had, they would use anything up to 20% or even up to 50% of cod liver oil. And what it makes actually a very easy spread. Like it's almost like putting butter on bread. But you can just imagine what it tastes like when you have salted horse fat and cod liver oil mixed together in a single mixture. It tastes exactly as you would imagine it. And there's a very good reason why this isn't done anymore. But we were commemorating his life. He died about 10 years back. And I brought this to the party because they had all listened to the story. And that is exactly how much people ate that day. And the rest of it I still have. And if you ever come to Iceland in the next few weeks, I could probably give you the rest of it. So here's a map of Iceland. And in the year 1900, there were only 3 places in Iceland which had a population of over 1,000 people. Reykjavik was by far the largest then, as is it now, and counted almost 6,000 people. But the other 2 places were just over 1,000, and they were Ísafjörður and Akureyri. And in 1900, the population of Iceland did not reach 80,000. It was 78,000. And today we have almost 4 times that number living in Iceland. So a lot has changed. And that is also the same year as about 70% of the population still lives in these turfed houses, huts, or shanties. So yes, you could compare it to Albania, except for the Albanians at least live in a warmer climate. Now, one of the first milestones in Icelandic independence at that time is not World War II, but World War I. The Nordic countries were clever enough to stay out of World War I and did that by hoping their neutrality could keep them out of the war. But nevertheless, we were part of Denmark, and Denmark fell under the influence of Germany simply by being situated right next to Germany. So all ties to Iceland were more or less cut during the war. But we were under the zone of the United Kingdom. And we started to do a lot of trade. There was a bigger market now for our fish. There was a bigger market for meet, and we sort of became independent during that time, which ended actually in 1918 by us becoming an independent country, but the Kingdom of Iceland. And that in the middle is actually the coat of arms for the Kingdom of Iceland. You probably know the coat of arms as it is today. This kind of looks like a comic version of our current coat of arms. But this was our coat of arms for the period of 1918 to 1944. And there you can see people gathering when we declare ourselves as an independent country. However, at the time, foreign affairs were still being conducted by Denmark, and we had still a Danish king. So now we had caught up with sort of modern times around us, even though that we were slow starters and weren't fast paced. Here are a couple of interesting pictures from Reykjavik in the 1930s. That's Zeppelin flying over Iceland. It didn't stop in Iceland, but it did send a rope down to pick up post. And it was sort of part of their travel. So we had rich Europeans flying over Iceland in that time. And that is a picture of sheep in Reykjavik. Since Reykjavik was growing not so fast, we'll see a picture of on a map to show you how large Reykjavik was at the beginning of World War II. At the same time, what happens in Iceland as in elsewhere in the world is that the Great Depression sort of gets a hold of the entire world over the years, and our industry was very, very poor. So most of the things that we had to buy, we had to import, and most of the currency that we had to get, we had to export. And during a Great Depression, that's really, really hard. So whatever sort of good times we had around World War I, if we could call them good times, they were wasted by the time of the Depression. And we even have names in Icelandic, like those who come from the area Hafnarfjörður are called Gablarar. And that's a very strange word in Icelandic. It actually means the end of a house. And they actually carry this name with pride today. They call themselves still Gablarar. But what it really meant was that during the Depression, though day laborers who were waiting for work were called Gablarar, because they waited at the end of the house hoping to get work that day. And Hafnarfjörður was actually a poor area within Iceland, so they had a lot of these. And the name still stays with the people who live in Hafnarfjörður. Events in Europe were catching up with us. Here's a little bit of nice information. You might be able to use it in a trivia contest sometime. But Time magazine picked Hitler Man of the Year in 1938. And what's good to carry away from this is that Time magazine does not pick the Man of the Year based on who is the best man or who is the most good man. They simply base it on who is most influential and whose year it was. And if you look at the picture on that cover, you see that it's Dantesque. It's like Inferno of Hell. He's playing an organ, and you have bodies of people being rolled round in a wheel. So they never, ever said he was good. They just said he was the most influential man of the year 1938. And this was a gathering storm, and Europe was well aware of what was going on. And again, the Nordic countries were hoping that by proclaiming their neutrality, they'd be able to stay out of this war as they had done in the First World War. But this was not to be. We would be caught up in this war with a vengeance. So first it was Finland. They were invaded by the Soviet Union. And in fact, Finland had, like Iceland, claimed its independence in World War I due to a bit different reasons. They had been part of Russia before. And since the Bolshevik Revolution was in Russia, they managed to proclaim their independence. And this war started partially because the Soviet Union wanted to expand their borders. And the Winter War is fairly famous. The Finns did actually lose the Winter War, but they managed to hold on for so long and cause the Soviet Union so much trouble that they negotiated a peace. And this turned out much better for Finland than if they had just surrendered. Following that, Germany, just before invading France, invaded Denmark and Norway. And this had a lot to do with iron ore and also military bases. So Germany was expanding its area of control. And this made the British fearful that the next target would probably be Iceland. And we'll talk about that shortly, why that was very important to England. So they invaded Iceland. And pay attention, they actually did invade the country. They tried as much as they could through diplomatic means to get Iceland to invite them to come, but that failed. So they ended up just taking us over. However, Iceland has never had a standing army, and it was an invasion without any casualties. And it was sort of a done thing. So the Icelandic government issued out a statement where they asked Icelanders to receive the British well and cooperate with them. However, many Icelanders were very resentful that their peace had been violated in such a way. Now, for anyone who is particularly interested in this, because this is sort of shared Nordic history, I did design a campaign about the Norwegian campaign for a gaming system called Flames of War. And if you just Google in the search words Firestorm Norway, Flames of War, you will find it's online for free, this particular game. And there's quite a bit of history in it. Like every chapter has some historical parts where I'm just describing why things happened and what happened at each time. So even though you're not a gamer, you might actually find it interesting to read. But I just leave that up to you. And I think it's interesting, but then again, I think almost everything in here is interesting. So why were the British so worried about what would happen to Iceland and the Germans would come here? Well, the main thing was location. England ruled the seas. They had a very large navy. However, Iceland is situated in such a way that we are partially in the shipping lanes between North America and England. And whoever controlled Iceland could build airports here, and they could control the waters around Iceland. And that's actually a quote from one of the men that organized the invasion of Iceland, Alexander Cadogan. Home at 8, dined and worked, planning the conquest of Iceland for next week. Shall probably be too late. Saw several broods of ducklings. This is taken from his diary. And I've always found it amusing that the name that the British decided for the invasion of Iceland was Operation Fork. And could even have been that Alexander was just eating his dinner when he decided the name, because this is the least ambitious name for a military operation that I think I've ever come across. Well, there's one that's called Operation Mincemeat, but that was a deception plan. But everything else gets sort of a nice name like Overlord and Supercharge or something like that. But Operation Fork is not even Trident. It has nothing to do with the sea. It's just a fork. So Reykjavik at the time, when the armies came, they didn't find a lot of housing, so they had to build these Nissen huts all over the place. And these particular Nissen huts that you see there are situated where now today you see Hallgrímskirkja. And the gallery of Einar Jónsson, the sculptor, is there in the background. And today that's not the largest house you will see in that area. But at that time, no one was living at Skólaárholt. Still find it interesting that they sort of just planted them down randomly, it looks, at the beginning. But during the occupation, these camps became better and better organized. Now there's a picture of Reykjavik taken in 1942. And you can see on the map the picture of Reykjavik today. And the red outlines show the part where Reykjavik was in World War II. However, during the war, and the census for 1942 was, there were 42,000 people living in that small area. And today, in 2020, of course, in the capital area, we have now well over 200,000 people. However, today, in the same red area, we have only 22,000 people. And this has a lot to do with because, well, the same man who taught me about Bræðingur, or the melt, as I talked about, the horse fat and the cod liver oil. When my wife and I bought our first apartment, he came with his wife to visit and looked over our apartment, and he immediately suggested that we should rent out the 2 bedrooms in the apartment and we could sleep in the living room, because that was the way he lived when he was young. However, we are just a different generation altogether, and we had no intention of taking people into our small apartment. So, as I said before, Iceland was coming out of a very hard depression. Unemployment was very high. We were even coming to that place where they were debating whether they should close the Icelandic embassy in Denmark, which was the only embassy we had abroad. But with the army coming here, the army had to build almost all its infrastructure. Reykjavik Airport, which you can see very well in that photograph of old Reykjavik, the British built that airport and several others in Iceland. And then they had to build roads, and they had to build bridges to get between places. And on top of that, not only did almost every person in Iceland get the chance to get a job. Should actually have added a picture there of the women who were washing for the army, but these are men that they are building one of the airports. So unemployment just vanished overnight, and the occupying armies actually paid a bit higher salary than the people had before, and particularly for the women who were working with the army, who were working in laundry or catering. Many of them had actually never by themselves had money, like real currency. So this was a drastic change for the people. Of course, in war, some things are very hard to get, but it made a huge impact on them to all of a sudden have a steady and good income. And at the same time, we had a fishing fleet, and we didn't have to send off our sailors to the Navy. So Iceland became sort of a fishing area for England and then America. So we could export any fish we caught, we could sell it. And during the war, everyone found jobs, and everyone had a very steady and good income. And there weren't that many, there were a few attacks on our boats. There were a few attacks on Iceland itself, but they were absolutely minimal. So we went through the war without any heavy losses. So it was economically a very, very good war for us, because by the end of the war, we had become one of the richer European nations, going from one of the poorest at the beginning. So that is the basis for the Blessed War. It was not just the incomes that changed. Culturally, the war had quite an impact as well. A number of new things came to Iceland, and this actually made Iceland probably the most Americanized of the Nordic countries for a long while, because American culture, after the first occupation for the first 2 years by the British, the Americans took over. And also for a short time, the first Canadians deployed in Europe were deployed to carry out the defense of Iceland. So we had very strong cultural ties all of a sudden to America, which hadn't been so strong before. One of the side effects was actually called ástandið, and that's what happens when middle-aged men are really concerned about who young women are picking. At one point, there were almost as many soldiers in Iceland as there were the male population. And that's the entire male population. So there were about 50,000 soldiers in Iceland, and we had just over 50,000 males in Iceland. But these soldiers were all young and fit, had nice uniforms, held dances, could provide things that were not easily attainable for Icelanders. And of course, we had young women who were interested in them. And some of them married, some of it went very well, some of them got pregnant and never married. There was even a rule, or actually a regulation in the American Army, that American soldiers were not allowed to marry women in other countries, because the United States was concerned that they might actually have to pay alimony for too many children. And then there were also stories about all kinds of things that were connected to this, but it never really became the problem the naysayers said it would become. It was never a large part of the young women that actually married soldiers from abroad, and there were that many children who were born. However, sadly, the children that were all born out of wedlock were frowned upon and were sort of had a very hard life for the next decades after the war. And many of them got, the patronyms were like Hermannsson, which in Icelandic, actually it's a male name, Hermann, but it also means just a soldier's son, or Karlsson, just meaning that they had a man as a father. So many of the children were actually fatherless after the war. So there are sad stories there, but as a major problem, it never came to be. Of course, there was a cost to the war. And the cost to the war for Iceland was minimal. Most of the people who died were sailors, were traveling mostly with cargo to and from Iceland. And usually most of these ships were sunk somewhere close to England, or at the end of the war, closer to Iceland. But as you can see, it's actually surprising that for a country like ours, that we do not have an exact fixed number, but we almost know the names of every single one. The debate is actually as to a few ships, whether or not they were lost due to bad weather, or if they had been attacked by the Germans. So the number that we can agree upon without doubt is probably around 164, but it could be up to 200 people who died as a direct cause of the war. And that percentage is about 0.17%. You can compare that to the US and Canada, and you can see that Iceland lost about half of the percentage of the population. But then we can compare it to countries which were much more active as a war zone, like the Soviet Union, where you almost jumped up to 15% of the entire population dying in the wars due to causes of the war. That particular picture is taken from an Icelandic sailing vessel. It was close to the Westman Islands when it was attacked by a submarine. And the German submarine didn't want to waste a torpedo on such a small ship, so they fired at the ship using anti-aircraft guns. So they more or less machine gunned the entire ship, but it didn't sink. And I think it was 6 in the end, who died in that particular attack. But they did sink a few of our ships, 6 in total. Now, because I hold out the page of Iceland in World War II, I've been lucky having such an open profile that people have been contacting me and they've been sharing the stories about their uncles, grandfathers, or other people that somehow were connected to Iceland at the time. And we have a nice picture here. The picture which is on the front of the book. Well, I know who the photographer is, and that was well recorded. And the boy on the picture is Helgi Hallarsson. Helgi Hallarsson was a captain in the Cod Wars when we were fighting over who could fish near Iceland with England. However, the soldier had always been unknown in Icelandic books. And in fact, was not recorded in the British archives either. But due to the book and the Facebook page, his family contacted me and told me who he was. And then they shared some pictures of him as a young man. And this definitely is Roy Milton Pryor. So I always liked that picture because it shows sort of, in a nutshell, what the war was in the beginning for Icelanders. Here you have a fully dressed soldier coming from another country. They have invaded the country and taken it over. We sort of feel childish in comparison with a young boy there holding a toy rifle. And behind them, you can see a house in poor repair. There's not much paint on it in that particular picture. The house still stands in Seltjarnarnes. And behind there, you can see the tents that many of the British soldiers had to stay in when they came to Iceland. And these tents, I'm sure they spent many a cold night in those tents, because these tents are not really made for Icelandic weather. The man to the right on the picture is even more interesting. There was a woman who contacted me and she was asking about her grandfather, if I'd known where he could have been stationed and a few other questions. And I said, well, I really had to know more about the man himself before I could answer these questions. So did she know this and did she know that? And eventually she said, no. She was sorry to say that she didn't really know these things, but then she added, I'll ask him. And he is still alive. That's Geoff Robbins. He's 102 years old today. And in the second edition of the book, there's a segment based entirely on how he describes the war. So yes, I'm quite happy with the connections this book has made and the stories that I've been able to share. A short story about the British soldiers and the Americans who came here. We had a look at the Nissen Huts, but in the top left corner here, you can see that this is a British Nissen Hut. There's no insulation there. They have a very small coal burner, and Geoff Robbins wrote in his memoirs that they would often have icicles on the inside whereas the stove was red hot. It was so small. And they even had a trick that worked for a few days. They would throw in a rifle round into the stove, and when it exploded, everyone went running out, so you could move to the cot nearest to the stove itself. And look at the beds. You can see that these beds are just made from makeshift wood. And well, the British weren't well-to-do, and they didn't have everything they needed. By comparison, you can see the next picture of a man reading in this makeshift table is an American hut. And it's like a 5-star hotel compared to what the British soldiers had to endure. Now, outside, of course, Iceland is what Iceland has always been. Weather is not always nice. And it's great that we had some photographer taking a picture in such bad weather, people having a hard time just keeping their hats on. But when the army left, the poor people in Iceland moved into these huts, and we called them brakkar. And most of them were demolished as quickly as they could because they had a stigma of people living there who had been poor. And this was not a great surroundings to be a kid in, but this time in Icelandic history isn't very long. And we still now today have a few preserved huts, but we did not place any historical value of them at the time because we sort of had the stigma of these people being poor. So by now you should have some idea as to why it's called a blessed war. It's actually a direct quotation which has become popular, and there was an old woman who said that this was the blessed war who made her sons rich. And she would have been of the generation which actually saw this drastic change in their lives, moving from these turfed huts to modern cities, and all of a sudden being part of a nation that was now among the most prosperous nations in Europe or the world, for that matter. The last slide I just have there for a little while. It's a fun book from the Americans, teaching them how to speak Icelandic. I'm not sure anyone would have any particular use of this book because the way they're trying to teach the correct pronunciation is misleading. But then again, Icelandic is not really that simple to begin with. So yes, you can have a look at it. I'm sure later this is being recorded, so you'll have access to it. But the language guide and some of the other things there are very interesting for modern people to have a look at today. So this is my entire presentation for now. I'm open to questions, and if we do this again, we might do something like the highlights of World War II concerning Iceland, or talk about the American Icelanders or Canadian Icelanders who actually came back here in the war. And many of them had close relatives that they knew or could introduce themselves to. So there was some mingling there. Thank you.
That was wonderful, really interesting. And I had like 5 million questions, and I can see why we could have you come back and talk about some of the other things. Of course, the war brides is an interesting topic for us because we want to make sure that we keep track of everyone who did leave Iceland, no matter if they left in the regular Vesturfarskrá years, or if they left after, or even if they left today, we still want to put in their immigration notes. And there are people who contact us pretty frequently. I am a child of a soldier that was in Iceland. Can you help me find my family? And that's one of the things that we've done quite a bit of. And unfortunately, we have not had as much success with that as we would like. We do have more success with adopted children, and the ones from the war, the families really are, no, I don't think that would have happened with my dad. And so, we do find some though and get them connected, and there have been some good stories from it. I really love that picture of that little boy standing by that soldier, and I was wondering who that was. So I'm glad I jotted his name down so that I could look him up, and if with your permission, I'd love to connect that photograph to his page in Icelandic Roots in our database.
Actually, I think that that particular picture is now a public domain picture. So I don't think you'll have any problem with it. It's originally from the British Army, but it was published before 56. So by now it's by all rights, it's a public domain picture.
Okay, that's awesome. Because yeah, that would be great to put with Helgi's page. There's a question in the question and answer. Where are the huts today?
Some of them are close to the airport. You'll be able to find a few. And one of them was converted to a restaurant a few years back. And it's kind of a funny story because it was done by the city of Reykjavik to convert it into a restaurant. And they had to do very expensive changes to it for it to be a restaurant. And that was kind of the thing about the Nissen huts, is that they are very cheap to manufacture and very quick to put up. And but refurbishing it to modern standards, it turned out it was probably cheaper just to tear it down and build a proper restaurant in its place. But I thought it was kind of sweet that we should have now at least one that has been preserved to ideal standards. And then we have, at the end of the war, the military left, and rather than pay for everything that they'd done here, they left as part of payment all these huts. So in the Icelandic countryside, you will see them in the strangest places, not because the army had built them there, but because they had actually been sold after the war, and farmers had moved them to different locations. But the next highest concentration would be Hvalfjörður, which is close to Reykjavik, where the Allies used as a very sort of gathering harbor. It's a very deep fjord, and they had facilities there to keep ships. So the Arctic convoys would gather there before they left to Russia. And then we have in Reyðarfjörður, there's a museum there that's in these kinds of huts. So they preserved them very well. And that's on the eastern part of the country, not very far from Seyðisfjörður, where the ferry stops. And if you go to Iceland in World War II, and you're coming to Iceland, I have a guide I can share with you. So like where you can go and what you could see. And I can even send it to you, Sina, and just put it up on your page.
Yeah, that would be great.
The major locations where you can find any remains from the war. We have a Commonwealth graveyard with over 200 graves of soldiers. Many of them were airmen who died here just due to aircraft failure while they were flying. Because none of them were shot down, but the aircraft they were flying in Icelandic circumstances and at the edge of their technology. However, we do not have an American cemetery, since at the end of the war, the US Army decided to combine cemeteries, and those who had died in Iceland were actually moved to a cemetery which is in North America. It was in the same area. So but we do have a memorial in the graveyard where the Americans are remembered. And in fact, General Andrews, who was supposed to lead the US Army in Northern Europe, he died in Iceland on his way to America. And his successor is, of course, much better known, and that's Eisenhower. So, but Andrews was the man who was supposed to be the leader of Normandy, but he died in a plane crash flying to America through Iceland.
There's so much interesting. So Russ Magnuson says, I find this incredibly interesting and such a bonus to know that you are my third cousin. You're probably the closest relative I believe I have in Iceland. Well, Russ, you have to click on your My Cousins and then see if you have any others that are closer, because I bet you do if you have Jökull as your third cousin. So you'll have to look in the database.
My email, and you can also look at Iceland World War II. Please do contact me, and then it was through my grandmother when you're saying that we are connected.
Yeah, yep, through your grandmother. Yeah.
So I was thinking about it. I was speaking to Sina before. Yes, my grandmother's life was actually very hard. She came from the Western Fjords on the northern side, which is one of the hardest places where you could live in Iceland. And she lost her mother when she was very young, so she was in foster care on many farms. And it was not until she met my grandfather and she moved to Reykjavik that her life started to improve. So I'm sure our common ancestors had a very hard life in that area of Iceland.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it'd be fascinating actually to know who it was that moved to America and where and how they fared. So yes.
You'll have to come join the data. You'll have to come join the database so you can see.
Yes, but database will only tell me so much. I'm always interested in really knowing about the people. As you can see, like I made that Bræðingur for this party, and just because at the beginning, when you're looking at world wars, you tend to pick heroes and you tend to look at the highlights. But the more you progress, the more you just become more and more interested in like what were the ordinary people doing. These were just ordinary people at extraordinary times, and what kind of foods were they eating? What kind of music were they listening to? And what was their income? How did they live? I'm steadily becoming more and more interested in those things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's a question here. It says, were there many or any soldiers that stayed and lived in Iceland after the war permanently, or was it much more likely that some Icelanders left with the soldiers?
Much more likely that the Icelanders would leave with the soldiers. I'm trying to think of any pure example where the soldier moved back to Iceland. I think there are a few cases of that, but you have to keep in mind that this is in 1945. So the general rule was that the husband would have the higher income, and the armies didn't send a lot of single women to Iceland. And what few they did send, they usually just had boyfriends within the same group. Joff married his wife here in Iceland, and he came back to bring her to England at the end of the war. And the poor man actually had great difficulty in doing that because he could use military transport to come to Iceland and see his wife. And by that time, they actually had 2 children together. But he could not use military transport to move her back to England. And this was just a normal, working class man from England. So it was expensive for him to bring his family back to England. But they stayed together until she died, and he's still alive.
My great aunt was a nurse, and she was in Iceland as one of the translators and the nurse. And Crystal Spears, one of our volunteers for Icelandic Roots, she did a wonderful piece on the nurse cadets. And so you can see a picture of her in our blog post through Icelandic Roots. So it's really cool. There's a really good question here. Was Winston Churchill's visit to Iceland during the war well publicized in Iceland?
Super well publicized in Iceland. And here's the thing that has also happened, that I've had a few queries because families of men who had stayed in Iceland, were soldiers here at the time, many of them had pictures of Churchill's visit. So the people were fascinated as to how their uncle or grandfather or whoever it was managed to get such a great picture. But the thing was, there were official photographs sold of the visit afterwards. And many of the soldiers, of course, did not have cameras. Cameras were not common at that time. They would buy these pictures and bring them back home. So many of the soldiers who came back home, the only pictures they had from that time were of Churchill and his visit. And he went to Alþingi, the main parliament building in central Reykjavik. He stood there on the balcony. He did some public visits, went to see the soldiers. He did quite a lot in this single day that he stayed here. So yes, it was very well publicized.
There's a question from Peter. In 1979, I was hiking in Hornstrand across the fjord from Isafjord. We came across some old Nissen huts. Do you know which units were way up there in the northwest and why they were there?
Actually, I think the largest base that was built there was built post-World War II. That's part of the Cold War. It was built as a radio post to monitor aircraft. There might have been a small radio post there in World War II, and there were definitely Nissen huts in the Western Fjords because they had small stations or garrisons all over the country. But this was not a main area for them in World War II. That would have been mostly in the east, but when the Cold War came, these radio stations and radar stations were very important at the beginning and all the way through the Cold War.
There's another question. Are the bunkers between the Natura Hotel and the Peplin going to be preserved? And is it true that they had logs to appear as guns for the enemy? And thanks for a great talk.
I can't tell you about if they had logs for guns, but yes, I think maybe not there, because these particular bunkers had a different purpose, but they might have put up dummy guns around the coastline, because the British really believed that the Germans could come here at any time. And they had been shocked at the speed that the Germans had managed to conquer Norway. So they had very strange ideas about what the Germans were capable of. However, the Germans themselves didn't have any plans to come to Iceland until after the British occupation. And that was because Hitler decided that they should make plans, and he sort of felt he'd been cheated out of this prize. And now the German army should make plans to conquer the island. However, German high command, which were professional soldiers, realized that although technically they could probably conquer Iceland, there was no way with the small amount of ships that they had available to them that they could keep it and provide provisions for the country and everything they needed to run an army from here. So the plan that was drawn up is called Operation Icarus. And if you know your Greek mythology, you'll realize what that actually means. Icarus was the hero who flew too close to the sun, and his wings burnt, and he fell to the ground and died. Now, I definitely think that there was no coincidence that the men who planned this operation picked this morbid name, thinking that, yes, it could be done, but there's no way that this will be successful in the long run. Now, the bunkers are still there. They have not reached the required age to become automatically preserved. And for many years, has nothing been done to preserve them. But the largest concentration of war remains is still in Jökull, which is the area where you describe. And in the summertime, we've had some historical walks there, explaining what you can actually see and what actually is there. And I know the Museum of Reykjavik, which runs several museums, they are interested in preserving this area, because this is almost everywhere else, these bunkers have been torn down. There is a house, however, in Seltjarnarnes, where if you buy that house, there is still standing a full bunker in the garden. And I'm quite happy that the people who own that house haven't done anything to tear that bunker down.
That's interesting. A question here. How would you describe modern day views in Iceland to how the occupation has affected Icelandic culture to this day? And also, thank you for a great webinar, is the comment from the same person.
Views of the occupation in Iceland today are all over positive. And we talked about Ástandið, the time where the Icelandic women were dating soldiers coming from abroad. The view now towards that is that it was actually a crime as to how the population treated the children and the women themselves. So the view has changed drastically through the years. But if you look back and you read testimonies from this time, you can see the resentment of the Icelanders towards being occupied by a foreign nation, although Iceland was dominantly pro-Allied. We of course, had some who were pro-German before, and we even had a small Nazi party in Iceland before the war. But these people didn't end up being arrested. In fact, funnily enough, the only political arrests which were done in World War II in Iceland were of the communists. And you'd find that far-fetched until you realize that in the years between 1939 and 1941, Hitler and Stalin were friends. And they had this non-aggression treaty, and that affected some of the Icelandic communists in the way that they looked upon the Germans as being pro-Soviet and the English Empire being the capitalist enemy. So they behaved very badly and strongly towards the occupation forces. And it actually ended up that they arrested a few of the communists, and one of them was a member of parliament. And this was against everything that the British had stated they would do, because it was not a violent protest. It was just simply a very sort of aggressive protest. And then Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden the English Empire wasn't so bad and Hitler was the bad guy. So for the rest of the war, that was fine.
Well, this is fascinating. Randy says, thank you for the great presentation. And then Susan says, thank you for the great webinar. It makes me want to find out more information about my dad's brother that served in Iceland during World War II. And I agree, it makes me want to learn more about my great aunt that was there and about the time that she was there, and fill in more about the timeline. You know, on the Icelandic Roots on our database, we have a timeline of events. It would be interesting to add more information into that timeline. More people. Go ahead.
I was going to say that you have my email now, and you also know how to find me on Facebook. And I'm the only one who answers to Iceland in World War II. So if you leave a message there, I'd definitely be me. And for my part, I'm really interested if there's a good story there, we would do a small segment about that person. And in fact, when the book was republished, the second edition is mostly based on the stories that came to me through Facebook. Sort of a more human factor to the story that had been there before.
There's someone that says, where can we find your book?
Yes, that's a tricky question. First of all, I'm not the publisher, so I have a publisher, but this publisher is an Icelandic-based publisher, and the book was marketed as a book for travelers in Iceland. So you can find it online through Icelandic sites, but here's the crux. If you do that, you'll be paying Icelandic postage. So that's about almost more than the book itself. So I've actually suggested it to Sinna, and she might want to look into it in the next year, that maybe you would be allowed to do a limited production run of the book in North America, and then it would be much easier for you to get the particular book. But that's something you'd have to finalize with the publisher here in Iceland, because he doesn't sell it through Amazon. And it's the world of publishing. In fact, just as a side note, I've finished my third book. I've done the second draft of it, but it's being delayed right now because of the supply chain in the world. There's not enough paper to publish all the books before Christmas, and my publisher has delayed the process of this particular book until all the other books have been published. So you don't always think the global crisis affects you, but then something silly like there's not enough paper to print books becomes a problem.
We have that same issue. There's a little children's book and coloring book that we've been working on and wanted it to be released before the end of the year. And we're going to be waiting too, because it's just, the publishing is just the hardest part.
Because it connects to World War II, I just want to tell you this short story. If you work in civil defense or civil administration, you will realize one of the horror words that you can use is JIT, which stands for just-in-time inventory, because a modern city can only sustain itself for a measurement of maybe a week before you have serious problems if you cut the supply lanes to it. And in World War II, for example, there's the siege of Budapest, which was in Hungary. It's not much spoken of, but it took almost as long a time as the siege of Stalingrad. And there are a number of books available about people who lived there at the time. And one young woman, she stayed with her family in the basement of an apartment building with a few other families, and they sustained themselves for 100 days using only what was available in their own apartments. But then people had like maybe a sack of 20 kilos of wheat. Someone had that. Someone had potatoes in a large quantity. So like each household could sustain itself for a long time. But our supply chains now, like a car manufacturing factory, will not have the materials they need for cars. They may be able to do 30 to 100 cars per unit, and then they need other stuff to be brought in. So yes, paper, aluminium, there's a lot of things that are suddenly in shortage.
Yeah. Nancy says, how about an e-version of the book? Like on a Kindle or online somewhere?
Yes, again, we come to that point. It has to do with publishing. So since I'm signed by contract to a publisher, that's actually a great thing for an author. If you have a publisher and you tell him, I have a deal for a book, and he says, yes, we'll publish it. And then you can just work with it and you don't have to have the hassle of trying to find a way how to publish it. So no, I think if we can do this in the following year, that we can look into it. If we can do a limited run, for example, for something like Icelandic Roots, I think that would be clever, because then the prices will be more manageable. Otherwise, you just have to come to Iceland and get the hard copy of the book.
Yeah, I'll just have to bring a suitcase and fill it full and bring it back.
That might work, but I'm sure the other thing would be more sensible in the long run.
Yeah, they also said that the price of publishing a book in Iceland is so much more expensive than publishing in North America too. And that
it is. We have a very strange market. We still are one of the nations in the world that actually buys more books per person than most other countries. But this too has also been in a sharp decline. over the last few years. So like a run of a book in Iceland, any book that reaches over 500 books in sales is considered to be fine. And then we have some like big star authors who do a lot better than that. But my books have done just fine. So, but for someone like me, that doesn't really change how I live or anything. It's a hobby, and I'm very happy that I have this publisher. So whatever I do, I usually get approval before I start. But yes, no, there's no ebook. And by the way, I do read a lot of history books. And if you're looking at World War II books, which are based on pictures a lot as well, I find that those are not the best ebooks you will read. The good ebooks are like thrillers or just direct books with text. But immediately the book becomes more complicated. You want to go back and forth in it. They're not as much fun when they're ebooks.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, it's better to hold the book in your hand too. That's nice.
I can say this as well. One of the guidelines I have when I'm writing a book is that I feel that you should be able to take the book with you into bed. And you should be able to read it before you go to sleep. Books that are very large and heavy are not very good for this purpose, and that's not what I aim for. Oh, and a technical thing, the first version of the book was actually measured in time. You were supposed to be able to complete it on a plane trip from Iceland to America.
That's awesome. Very good. Well, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much for your time and all of the interesting topics that you covered in this webinar. And we'd love to have you come back again. And thank you everyone for attending. And thank you, Doug. And we will see you again.
Yes, and thank you. And also one thing I like to compliment you. I do find it fascinating when people sort of hold on to their historical past in such a way. And in Canada, at least, where this Icelandic community I met there, they were very active in this part. So great work that you're doing. So thank you.
It's very fun. We have a great team, and we're going to be celebrating our 8-year anniversary this week on November 12th. We officially became a 501c3 nonprofit. Of course, we were doing this work for a decade or more before it, but the official nonprofit work started on November 12th, 2013. And so 8 years now, we've been officially doing this. And on last year and this year, Doug's here, he's the treasurer, but last year and this year, we gave out $12,000 in grants, heritage grants and scholarships. And we do a lot of other good things too that are miscellaneous and that weren't counted in on that 12,000 US dollars. So it's a great organization, and we're happy to be a part of it, and glad to be able to have these educational webinars. So thank you.
Thank you, Mac.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.